morning, and thank you very much for joining us. I am Yori Folari. As you recall, on Sunday there was news of the power grid collapse. Some of the offshoots of this was power going out entirely at the airport, the Murtala Mohammed Airport, and much was made of that in the press. But on the same day, hours later, power was indeed fully restored. And so today we'll be looking at the troubled power sector in our country. And our guest is actually Yemi Oke, Professor of Energy and Electricity Law at the University of Lagos. He's currently not in the country, but we won't let that stop us. We can connect with him remotely. Good morning to you, Prof. I did say good morning to you, Prof.
Good morning, sir.
Okay, thank you very, very much. I had just been boasting that Professor Oke is not in the country, but we would not let that stop us. And then, unfortunately, there was a glitch. When I said good morning, I didn't get a comeback. A fine morning to you, Prof.
Good morning. Nice to hear your voice again. It's been a while.
Same here, Prof. And compliments of the new year, because we'll continue to say that, even as we are in February. Well, we are laughing now. It's not as if it's not a serious matter, but perhaps not as serious as some people tried to make it out. There were reports of the national grid collapse and on Sunday, but on that same day, I think hours later, there was a restoration. But in the meantime, it had wreaked havoc. Okay, now going from there, it wasn't as if that was a solitary incident or it was one in a very long while. There had been a number of such collapses. And what they're saying, what we're being told has emerged from investigations is that it's an inadequacy of a gas supply. Prof, how troubled, really, would you say that the Nigerian electricity power sector is? How troubled is it?
Well, I would say it's a scary situation. It's a worrisome trend. I mean, if anybody doesn't know the extent to which we are challenged as a nation, then you need to read the power outage at the international airport. It's as embarrassing and as serious as you can imagine. We are in a serious, challenging situation as far as the power sector is concerned. But talking about the grid collapse that you mentioned, I've said we have had several grid collapses. Quite frankly, we expect as industry persons, we expect to have more. At some point, we are predicting almost accurately we're going to have 14, we're going to have 15. At some point, we're having 13 in a year. Around November, we are saying, oh, 2 to go, and it happened. Nobody is happy with those trends. When we talk of grid collapse or collapse, there are several reasons why a grid will collapse. One, its grid is like the warehouse of what is generated in the country before it is distributed. And that is managed by the federal government. When Nigerian power sector was conceived, it was conceived as a federal monopoly far back as even in 1861 when it first started. The kind of grid that we have was envisioned not for the kind of humongous population and social advancement, socio-economic advancement that we now have as a country. What have we done now that we are faced with the challenge of inadequacy of our grid infrastructure? How much of expansion have we done? And when will we start to expand those grid infrastructure? How do we monitor our grid? Because you must have a situation room. In this age and time, we can't be talking of grid collapses because those infrastructure will have given you early warning signs. No, these are high-tech things that will let you know that in a particular turbine, in a particular substation, there are certain challenges, there are certain pieces, there are certain things that are not properly aligning. In a typical situation, if you allow two positive wires to bridge, if you have a good cycle system, it's going to trip off. The same thing. So even for overgrown weeds or trees, they could cause a kind of breach in the transmission infrastructure or transmission lines. So how do we monitor those? How do we take care of those? Also, when you have a grid that is designed for 3,000 megawatts, in trying to expand, you are trying to take on board 4,000 megawatts of generated electricity. It's going to burst. The same thing in the pipeline. If you have a pipeline that's designed for 500 liters or 500,000 liters, if your demand outstrips that, then you want to expand, you can't put 1,000 liters in a structure that is designed for 500. That's the challenge we're having. That's why we've been hearing of grid collapses, load rejection, and you can't store electricity. If a megawatt is generated and is rejected, where is that going to go? There are several reasons why we tend to have grid collapses, and we might continue to have grid collapses as a nation because we haven't really done what we ought to do. And who's in charge? Federal government keeps on to the transmission infrastructure. TCN is still a federal asset, but is a regulated entity. NRC is the one in charge. And when we had those grid collapses in the past, well, there were no sanctions. It was as if nobody was in charge. We didn't hear that anybody was seriously sanctioned, and there are certain things were done radically. As a country, we've made our mistakes in the power sector. Quite a number of those mistakes. Now, we must be ready to start to take certain serious critical decisions, tough decisions as a country, both at the level of the grid infrastructure and the entire power sector as a sector.
Indeed, Prof. Thanks for that overview, because part of the answer to the question I was thinking of are already embedded in your opening overview. But I was going to ask the part that the National Electricity Regulatory Council is supposed to be playing in all of this. And it has also been said that they themselves, that body itself, seems to lack the structures, facilities to effectively do its job. Because one of the things I'm thinking about is that surely if they would have seen this coming, if all was well. And then two, there have been a number of efforts at ameliorating this situation. You recall, Prof, in fact, you shared something with me, I think it was last week or so, something about observations on the effort to MAPI, the meter acquisition, that initiatives where, look, let's spread these meters as wide as possible so we can get revenue from being able to monitor consumption and all of that. But even that couldn't be pulled off effectively, such that the NERC had directed such monies to indeed be refunded. But even that has become something of a quagmire, not to call it a mess. So one begins to look at the whole process of regulating, and I would actually substitute the word understanding the power sector and the power grid in the country. I mean, it does seem to be in a comatose state. Perhaps that's the way it seems to those of us that are outside looking in.
That's an important observation you've made, and you made those observations quite correctly. Once you privatize, supposedly, the only job of a government is effective, serious-minded, knowledge-based regulation, because government cannot continue to be a player. So with the privatization, then we had the NERC, meaning government now was ready to regulate. Effective regulation is a question of the framework the law that you have to regulate and the regulatory instruments that have been put in place, as well as how do you deploy and apply those laws to achieve set objectives in this sector. I think we are challenging that. For several years, since 2005, we've been talking about the fact that this law, the Electric Power Sector Reform Act, then was not a law meant to operationalize the power sector, because we pointed out several errors, well over 200 documented. We gave it to them, and government couldn't immediately amend the law then, because then, according to them, because we reached out to them, they said they just privatized, and it wouldn't make sense to start to change the goalpost when a crucial goal was just scored. That made sense. After privatization, we said, oh, now this law will undermine the power sector. It took a while. We just had a law. They even changed by the name reform. It was a law meant to reform the power sector, no doubt. But now that we are done reforming, we now needed the law to regulate the sector. We just had that few months ago with the signing of the Electricity Act 2003 by President Tinubu. So meaning we are just about to start. But even most of the suggestions we made in the old law, quite frankly, have been incorporated, but not effectively implemented, because it's still early to start to now measure those. But then, effective regulation is key. The regulator is central to the success of the sector, of any sector. So everybody, I think there seems to be a consensus of opinion among Nigerians and industry players and observers that we haven't had the fortune of serious matter regulation in the power sector, because government is no longer involved. And if you don't effectively regulate, it will be challenging. Let me allude briefly to what you mentioned as to MAP, Meter Access Provider. We used to have CAPME. CAPME was a kind of a credit scheme that would give Nigerians access to buy meters and pay after a while. Now, meaning if you want to buy a meter, you can procure meter, pay 25,000 naira, then your subsequent electricity bill will have a bit of credit to get back to your money with which you purchase the meter, because meters are supposed to be assets of the discos. Then that company was working, and all of a sudden they changed it to MAP, Meter Asset Provider, which was somewhat similar, but given to corporate entities distinct from the discos. What we realized was that most of the discos are still indirectly owners of MAP. And that was supposed to be a repayment structure for Nigerians that are paid for meters. And we are saying, since this MAP started, how many Nigerians have been credited, have got refunds for meters they purchased? All is not well. Somebody was in charge or still in charge of those things. And we're not seeing the effectiveness, because Nigerians ought not to pay for meters ordinarily. They just ought not to pay for poles. They ought not to pay for transformers and all those assets. But then, we are where we are because we are challenged in terms of effectiveness of regulation. Everything boils down to regulation. Even TCN, that is still federal government, within the federal government purview, is a regulated entity. But how much of regulation do we have? At the level of TCN, in this age of artificial intelligence, AI, you mean you have a transmission infrastructure, and you cannot have a station like a situation room where you monitor all the entirety of the transmission infrastructure that you have in the country, and you get early warning signals and signs from those to know where those challenges and forces are coming from. So, I mean, we still a lot of challenges. I don't even know what to say. I don't want to do anybody, but it seems overwhelming. And know my worry, sir. One last point on that. Know my worry. In 2012, I was almost going to call a bad name. We had what was called Manitoba Hydro issue. Manitoba Hydro was a Canadian entity known in Canada. Manitoba Hydro had transmission management contract with with Nigerian Transmission Company to come and manage this so-called transmission infrastructure in 2012.
Okay.
That 2011. When, the contract was shrouded in secrecy, I raised serious objections. Because nobody was listening to me, I now had to write. I actually commissioned a research paper, an article that I published, and I deliberately published the article in University of Manitoba Law Journal so that the Canadian audience will hear that their company was about to fail in Nigeria because certain things were not being done right, and it was going to bring about or create a kind of corporate responsibility issues. Of course, the Manitoba contract burst within months after I wrote the papers, and people started saying whether Yemioke had access to certain intelligence, either from Canada or Nigeria. And I said, no, because we're not doing the right thing. Manitoba Hydro was to manage the transmission infrastructure. They left 2012, 2013, they left. Now we have Simens. And when Rewani, the renowned Rewani and I appeared on another station, we're talking about this Simens thing. It seems to be a bit optimistic, and I wasn't as optimistic as a practical person on the field. And now we are where we are. Siemens has been on, and the president had to go to Germany to go and engage the German chancellor to speed up Siemens miracles that we are still expecting. I'm not as optimistic to tomorrow. Maybe I want to be pleasantly surprised. I felt Siemens deal will go the way of the Manitoba as predicted in Manitoba, also as predicted in Siemens, because I saw the contract, I saw something that I wasn't quite comfortable with. But then I'm not the regulator. I can't speak for government. I'm not the one in charge. I'm just a concerned Nigerian, and I've been talking for more than 2 decades as to what we need to do, and we're not ready to do. I don't think we've done, and we're ready to do those things. But I expect Nigeria now to start to take very serious and unpleasant decisions in the power sector if you must get it right.
Well, one hopes that that indeed will be the case. But when one looks at the fact that when you compare what we are playing with in Nigeria, talking about 3,000 megawatts, there is a concern. It is said to be grossly inadequate, especially when you compare one with our aspirations, our ambitions. Here we are inviting the world to come to Nigeria. The market is open. President Bola Tinubu has been carrying that campaign. We're ready and willing to do business. But how can you do any of this without power? Now, I want to ask you, Prof, incessant grid collapses is one thing. We've touched very, very briefly on that. But there are calls for subsidy removal in the power or energy sector. I didn't even, well, maybe enlighten us a bit about the nature of, subsidy in that sector.
Let me start from where you initially took off, because that's important. Said we were having 3,000 megawatts before. To let Nigerians know we're in a deep mess and we need to do something urgently. If we're not having power, nobody's going to develop. We're not going to develop anyway. So let's be realistic. We're having 3,000 megawatts before privatization. More than 10 years after privatization, we're still oscillating around 3,000, 4,000. And we privatize, meaning not significant megawatts have been added despite privatization. And there are documented challenges and reasons why that is so. And that's not the topic for today anyway, because it talks about a whole lot of structuring issue, privatization issues that we'll be talking about. I will not stop talking about it. So, if we are generating even less than what we are generating then, and government now spending more in the supposedly privatized power sector, definitely you don't need a social to tell you that all is not well with the power sector in Nigeria, and invariably Nigeria. We'll get there. We're all optimistic we'll get there. Coming to the issue of subsidy, okay, I'm of the considered view, speaking for myself, that Nigeria is spending, the energy sector now as a bunch is over subsidized. We just got done away with the subsidy in the petroleum sector with the bold step taken by President Bola Tinubu. And I have to open on that. A lot of Nigerians are not aware that power sector is also seriously subsidized at various levels. We have MBUT, Nigerian Bulk Electricity Trading Company. That is a bulk trader that buys whatever megawatt that is generated so that the gencos will continue to produce. And whatever is produced, whether or not it's consumed, is paid for or guaranteed by the federal government. There are levels of subsidy in the power sector. I am of the opinion that we are subsidizing inefficiency. Who are we subsidizing? Because the same thing in the petroleum sector. The subsidy in the power sector is huge. That's not the real topic for the day because we don't want to go into the mathematics of subsidy. But who are we subsidizing? Mm-hmm. At what point? Let me give you a typical scenario of a yam seller. As a government, we want to subsidize yam consumption by Nigerians, either boiled or fried yam. And we keep giving money to the yam seller. Buy 2 bags of yam, get 50% discount, supply yam to Nigerians. We are subsidizing waste. The yam seller will go and buy rotten yam and peel off the waste and only be able to fry like 10 or 15% of the 2 bags of yam to the end users. So if you want to subsidize yam consumers, we'll say yam seller. We will subsidize the place of yam given to Nigerians. The man or woman selling yam will go and buy edible yam that are healthy so that most of the yam will not go to waste. So meaning you are subsidizing actual consumption, not the production. So we are subsidizing waste. In the UK, they subsidize power. But you go to get the bill of an average person living in the United Kingdom. You're going to see the electricity bill. You're going to see the actual amount that government is paying or has paid or will be paying to the generator, to the distribution companies, not generation. So when you subsidize hugely at the level of generation and transmission, you have not factored in transmission losses. Mm-hmm. If you subsidize 5,000 megawatts, by the time it gets to the tables of Nigerians to consume for electricity, for ironing, to watch TVC and other stations, the actual megawatts that is really available in terms of subsidy might be less than 2,000 megawatts. So you subsidize waste. So you don't subsidize effort, you subsidize result. So then what are we subsidizing? The discourse will tell you about their cost per unit of megawatts or cost per unit of kilowatt. Let's do the mathematics. Cost includes everything you spend, both for gas, both for your personnel and the rest. And we have challenges in collection, lack of efficiency in bill collection. And those will now go into subsidies of the federal government. Government is now paying for inefficiency even in collecting bills. Some homes, some estates, you have 10 flats, 8 of the flats are bypassed, 2 flats are the one paying for the power consumed in a particular location, and you are now subsidizing. We are subsidizing waste and inefficiency. When we get the discourse now to work on their overall cost, to bring on board efficiency, serious efficiency in the distribution, then you minimize the waste. So we can now determine what is actually being subsidized by the federal government if you must subsidize. But the power sector is not designed for that kind of subsidy. In the old Electric Power Sector Reform Act of 2005, I argued the same thing when tariffs were about to be increased. I said you cannot even think of increasing tariff without first putting PCAF in place. PCAF is a statutory obligation. PCAF is Power Consumer Assistance Fund, PCAF. It was in the old law. Gladly, PCAF framework is in the Electricity Act recently signed by President Bola Ahmed Tinubu. And Nigerians should be surprised to know that the PCAF structure has not been constituted. That is a mechanism that gives subsidy to poor, underprivileged Nigerians to be able to consume electricity when tariffs are being jacked up. So when you don't put PCAF in place, you end up subsidizing the high income earners, those who can afford their patterns of consumption, putting on AC for 24 hours. Not those who need electricity just to iron their clothes and watch TV in the night, maybe 1 or 2 points of fan to cool off for an hour or two. So there is great inefficiency in the management of the subsidy framework because pickup has not been effectuated,
yes.
even under the old law and under the current laws. There's a lot of challenges in the power sector.
It still is scary, nevertheless, to hear people calling for subsidy removal, even as you have explained it, that most Nigerians don't even realize that the sector is being subsidized. You referred to the UK briefly, and I recall, Prof, that there was a real crisis, consternation in the cost of electricity. The government was even talking about needing to come in and help, not about reducing, but it was such as it was, and there was danger. We don't have the climate where people could freeze to death, overnight in their beds in Nigeria, but it's as serious as it is over there. And there was an outcry that especially elderly citizens couldn't afford the electricity they needed to survive. So I was looking at, if anybody is calling for subsidy removal, such as you've explained to us, that unless you might not have known, but we're actually being subsidized. I mean, look at what has happened as a result of the removal of subsidy on fuel. Now remove subsidy, people can hardly pay what is required now. Yet, I take your explanation on board. The whole thing is looking a bit suicidal. If the right thing...
The subsidy is wrongly channeled. That's my conclusion. The subsidy is wrongly channeled. If you want to subsidize Nigerians, we know who to be subsidized. These subsidies are going into wrong avenues, going to wrong pockets, going to the wrongs of those who wouldn't even need the subsidy in the first instance.
In the analogy of the yam that you made, Prof, I beg your pardon, in the yam analogy, you spoke about the sellers. You didn't even go to the producers, the farmers. So I was waiting for a connect in there.
No, what we're saying is this: if you are, let's take it that the seller has produced yam, they have sold it to the retailer. And the retailer is now to give to those who are going to go, I mean, the wholesaler rather, and the wholesaler is going to give it to the retailer. And if you are saying you want to subsidize yam for consumption, please subsidize the plate of yam given to me, not the tubers of yam. Because if you subsidize tubers of yam, you are telling the yam wholesaler to be buying rotten yams. At the end of the day, most of the yams will get killed off as waste. The quantum that will be fried or roasted for me, put on my table, will be less than 10% of the actual tuber.
All right.
Meaning, we've been subsidizing waste. That's just the analogy. So if you want to subsidize, we know who to subsidize. And Nigerians really, who really need these subsidies, honestly, but if you give them 2-3 hours of electricity per day, they will be fine. It's just to iron their cloth and do basic things.
If they can depend on the regularity of such a minuscule supply.
I still say, Nigerians are willing and ready to pay slightly more for electricity if it's available.
You think, Prof?
But
you think so, Prof?
Nigerians to pay for darkness is criminal.
Okay. I got to take a break. I got to take a break now, Prof. And this is quite exciting as you're explaining it to the public. We'll take a break. When we come back, we'll look at the gas constraints and as it relates to the collapse of the grid, incessant collapse of the grid, and also the issue of dishonesty within the system. Talking here about energy thefts. I don't know if that's a particularly unique Nigerian situation. We'll be right back. Please stay with us, Prof.